So now that we have the ability to move the player left and right and up, we want to make sure that we take that code and we abstract it from the player class and create what we call a player controller. The idea behind that is if we want to change keys down the road or we want to add different types of input, we don't want to have all this hard-coded into our player class. So to get started, let's create a new script. We're going to call this player controller. We'll open up player controller in MonoDevelop. And we're going to need to add one public property. This is going to be a vector2, and it's going to be called moving. And here we'll create a new vector. Now, just like we did in our player class originally, we're going to want to clear the moving value on each new update. So we're going to do moving x equals moving y equals 0 to clear the values. Next, we're going to duplicate a little bit of our left and right key code logic here, but instead of us actually applying the force directly to the player, we're going to simply modify the moving value. So in the case of going right, we're going to set moving x to 1. If we're going to go to the left, we're going to set moving x to -1. So we'll start typing out if input get key right, else if input get key left. And we'll move these lines of code back over. We're going to set moving x to equal 1, copy this line, paste it, and set it to -1. Now we can do the same thing for moving up and down. So we'll copy this block of code and paste it below. And instead we'll set key up. We'll set, instead of doing moving x, we'll do moving y. And if we get a down key, which we don't really use in this game, but we're keeping it here for just consistency, we'll change y to -1. And at this point, this is all we really need the controller class to do. What we're going to do now is go into the player and have the player look for the controller and get the moving value to determine which way it needs to actually move. Make sure we save our script, and then we'll open up our player. And here we're going to add a private variable called player controller, and we'll just call this controller. Let's recreate our start method. And in here, we're going to look for the actual controller script that'll be attached to our game object. So we're going to set controller to equal get component. We'll pass it a type of player controller. And this is going to go out and look on the game object for any script that has a type of player controller. Next, we're going to want to modify our moving left and right blocks. We can actually delete these all together, and we're going to retype them out. So in this case, we're going to test if the controller moving x doesn't equal 0, we're going to move the player. Remember, moving left or right will set that value to 1. So as long as it's 0, we know that we need to move the player. Next, we're going to go back and just make sure that our absolute value is less than the maximum velocity we originally had set. So our absolute value x is now less than maximum velocity.x. And inside of this conditional, we're going to change the force for x to let the player know which direction he needs to move. Here, we're going to test if we're standing. If we are, we're going to set the speed to multiply by the controller moving x value. If we're not standing, we're going to multiply the speed by the controller moving x value multiplied by air speed multiplier. So what you may notice here is that we're no longer testing if we're moving to the left or right. And that's because, again, the moving x value is already going to be positive or negative based on what the key input is. So if we're moving to the left, this will be -1 multiplied by speed, and this will make the speed negative. If we're in the air, this will be either a positive or negative speed value multiplied by the airspeed multiplier. We're going to do the same for moving up as well. Here, we're going to test that the controller moving y value is greater than 0. From there, we're going to test that the absolute value of y is less than the maximum velocity y, and we'll simply set the force y to equal the jet speed multiplied by the controller moving y value. The last thing we want to add before we forget is the transform to make the player move left and right. Just under where we set the force x, let's go back in and create a transform local scale equals new vector 3. And in this, we're going to test that the force x is greater than 0, meaning that we're moving. If so, we're going to set it to 1. If not, we're going to use 1 and 1 for the y and z value for the rest of the vector. Make sure you save your script, and now we can go back into Unity and just make sure that there are no compiler errors and that when we run the game, we can test that we move left and right. But you're going to see here that we have an error. And the reason for this is that it can't find a reference to the controller. So let's stop the game and drag our player controller script onto our player. If we rerun the game, you'll now see that the error is gone, and we can now move our player left and right and up and down. Make sure you save your scene, and also go into your player and reapply the changes that we made back to the prefab. You'll now see that we have the player controller component attached to our game object.